Hello, everyone. Welcome to this month's session of the Psychonomic Society One World Cognitive Psychology Seminar Series. We're really thrilled today to have Dr. Alin Coman here talking to us about the groundbreaking large-scale social outcomes in psychological phenomenon from measurement to interventions. Dr. Coman does really interesting work trying to bridge individual and collective processes, trying to understand how our brains work in individual, typical how we understand psychological processes, and how that ends up causing large-scale social outcomes. He's an associate professor of both psychology and public affairs at Princeton University, received his PhD in 2010 from the New School of Social Research, and I'm really thrilled to have him today to share some of the insights from his really interesting line of research. So welcome to Dr. Coman.
Thank you, Lisa, for that introduction. I'm going to start sharing my screen. The title is slightly different from what I think has been advertised. Somehow in the game of telephone, the title got changed into something else, but this is the title of the talk, A Cognitive Grounded Approach to Emergent Phenomena from Measurement to Intervention. And I want to start off with a little bit of a data puzzle. And it has to do with how Americans remember Christopher Columbus. There's this research by Amy Corning and Howard Schuman, two sociologists, who asked about 1,400 people who were born in different years over time. You see it on the x-axis here, people born from 1936 all the way to 1999. They asked them to describe Christopher Columbus to a 14-year-old niece or nephew. The prompt was to describe this Christopher Columbus to somebody who doesn't know anything about Christopher Columbus. So what they did, they coded how positive or negative the description of Christopher Columbus was. And what you see in this graph is the percent of the cohort, birth cohort, that had a negative view of Christopher Columbus. What you notice, interestingly, is there are these bumps when it comes to the negative view of Christopher Columbus. There's a bump here starting late 80s, late 70s, early 80s, and then it continues to be a negative view of Christopher Columbus. Now, the question is, how could this happen? And they looked into the processes that could have given rise to this negative view of Christopher Columbus. And what they found is that it was the textbooks, history textbooks in the United States before the year 2000. It described Christopher Columbus using positive qualities. After the year 2000, only about 50% of the history textbooks describe Christopher Columbus using positive qualities. Similarly, Christopher Columbus was described as cruel and exploitative before the year 2000 in the history textbooks before the year 2000. And then almost 80% of the history textbooks describe Christopher Columbus as cruel and exploitative. So now what they were able to find out is that the negative view of Christopher Columbus was essentially due to this history textbooks that were being created and people had access to them. So that's how it came to be. Now, my question, as I saw this graph, I was at a conference, I saw this graph, my question was to do with this other bump. So I asked Amy, she didn't know exactly what was happening here. Sorry about that. My computer sometimes does this. She didn't know what was happening in this other bump, but my conjecture was that what happened here with this bird cohort is that these are the parents of people who started reading the history textbooks that contained a negative view of Christopher Columbus. So I love this example, and I want to start with this example just because I think it captures certain interesting things about the sort of phenomena that I'm investigating. So first of all, this is a collective memory of Americans about something that happened in their past. Okay, and I define collective memory as shared individual memories that bear on people's identities. And it's not only a collective memory, this collective memory is enmeshed with something else, with people's beliefs. These are collective beliefs about an important character in history, right? You can see Christopher Columbus as positive or negative, cruel or not, and you can have attitudes and beliefs about Christopher Columbus. And not only that, but thinking about this historical event could trigger certain emotions in communities of individuals, right? So people could feel guilt or shame or pride about a particular event that happened in the past. So this particular example showcases that collective memories, collective beliefs, collective emotions are deeply intertwined. And also, they are susceptible to all sorts of influences. Notice here, in terms of that positive, negative view of Christopher Columbus, there's a dynamic over time. It goes negative over time as a function of things that are happening. And I just want to feature here, in terms of my conjecture as to what happened in this bump, is this notion of conversations. People have conversations with one another, and those conversations are going to shape their representations, their beliefs, their emotions. One other point that I want to make on this slide has to do with the fact that I'm talking about Christopher Columbus and Americans remembering information about Christopher Columbus in large groups. So this is a nation that's remembering an historically relevant event. But collective memories, collective beliefs, collective emotions need not be about large groups such as nations. They can be about smaller groups such as families or universities remembering something, all the way to nations remembering and believing and experiencing emotions together. Okay. So, um, in my lab for the past 20 years, I've been investigating collective phenomena, um, um, particularly collective memory, collective beliefs, and collective emotions. Now, in all this time, what I've learned is that there are certain characteristics to collective phenomena. And these characteristics, one of the main ones is that they're psychologically grounded. What do I mean by that? What I mean by that is that if you take let's say that you have a community of individuals. These are the nodes in the community, and the links represent the connections between the individuals in the community. If you take an individual level cognitive mechanism and you upregulate that cognitive phenomenon, what's going to happen is you're going to end up observing large scale social outcome. In this situation, let's say that different subgroups of individuals from this large community start remembering things in different way, or start believing different things, or start experiencing different emotions as a function of upregulating that cognitive phenomenon. And if you downregulate that cognitive phenomenon, you might end up with a different emergent outcome. That is, the entire community now remembers or believes or feels similar emotions. Okay, so this is one of the important characteristics of this collective phenomena, that they're cognitively grounded, and I'll show evidence as to make this assumption a little bit more clear. The second characteristic of this collective phenomena has to do with them being interactively constructed. There's this notion that people have conversations with one another, have interactions with one another, and these collective phenomena are dependent on those interactions that are happening at a local level among individuals in their small social groups. And then finally, um, this phenomena, I found, they're very dynamic. That is, they change over time. Notice the Christopher Columbus memory. What happened is it changed over time as a function of things that were happening in the environment. So you have to be very careful when you try to understand this phenomenon, not to just take a snapshot of time to understand them, because you're going to miss out a lot of things when you do that. You have to understand the dynamical process involved in their construction and their change. Okay. Now, this is an approach that we talked about in this paper that we published in 2018, and I recommend anybody who's interested in exploring these characteristics to go and read that paper. For an overview of my talk today, what I'm going to do is I'm going to illustrate the work that happened in my lab over time on this three dimension constructs, collective memory, collective beliefs, and collective emotions, focusing on particular things from each of this project. So for collective memory, what I'm going to do is I'm going to ground this large scale social outcome, collective memory, in individual level cognitive mechanisms. For collective beliefs, what I'm going to do is I'm going to build on the work on collective memory, and I'm going to show you how political entrepreneurs could influence the collective beliefs of large communities. And finally, for collective emotions, what I'm going to do is I'm going to focus on the intervention aspect of large-scale collective outcomes. How can you intervene to change collective level phenomena? Okay, so that's going to be the focus. But I just want to give you a sample of the different experiments and the different studies that we run in my lab on all these different dimensions of collective phenomena. Okay, good. So the way we do it, the approach that we take is something that looks like this. You have a communities of individuals that experience certain events. So in this situation, you have community that were exposed to, say, the September 11 attacks. What happens is individuals, as they're exposed to the event, they form mnemonic representations. They form memories of what they're experiencing. So what you see here is the different pieces of information that they have about the events, and with different shades of grade, you see the activation, how activated the different pieces of information are in their minds. So what happens is people are encoding this information, they have mnemonic representations, memories, and then what happens is people have conversations with one another and they shape each other's memories as they have these conversations. Okay. Now, if you wanted to understand the collective memories of communities, what you're going to have to do is you're going to have to understand what are the cognitive processes that are involved in encoding and retrieval, in the encoding and retrieval of information. The other dimension that you want to understand is you want to understand how do people shape each other's memories as they are interacting with one another. Okay, and finally, what you also want to understand, if you want to understand the collective memories of the different individuals, is um, the social network structure that characterizes the conversations that people have in these communities. Okay, so the approach that we took in the lab and we're proposing is one that considers all these dimensions, all these processes that take place when it comes to people shaping each other's memories, shaping each other's representations. Okay. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to start from an individual level cognitive mechanism, and I'm going to walk you through this reasoning of how can we ground that cognitive mechanism in how large-scale social outcomes are grounded in that particular cognitive mechanism. Okay. And before I move on, I just want to give a shout out to Bill Hurst, my PhD advisor, who taught me during my PhD years, taught me this thinking when it comes to collective level phenomena and dynamics. Okay, so let's start from this individual level cognitive mechanism. A lot of people in the audience probably are familiar with this phenomenon of retrieval-induced forgetting. Retrieval-induced forgetting is defining that the simple act of retrieval does at least two things. One, it strengthens the memory trace for the retrieved information, so it makes it more likely for people to remember it in the future. But it also does another interesting thing. It induces forgetting an information that's related to what has been practiced, to what has been retrieved. Okay. Now, the paradigm, I'm going to remind the people in the audience, for people who do not know, they're going to learn more about it now. But the paradigm used to investigate retrieval-induced forgetting looks something like this. Participants study category exemplar pairs, fruit, apple, fruit, grape, drinks, vodka, drinks, rum, and so on. Then they receive retrieval practice for half of the items from half of the categories. They're told you studied some information in the study phase. what started with A in the fruit category, and people are supposed to selectively practice that information. Okay, but they receive retrieval practice for only half of the items from half of the categories, which creates three conditions: RP plus, retrieval practice plus, RP minus, retrieval practice minus, and NRP. This is a baseline category, no retrieval practice, against which researchers investigate the processes that take place during this act of retrieval, selective retrieval. And in the cued recall phase, participants are asked to try to remember all the fruits that they studied and all the drinks that they studied. Now, what happens? There are hundreds of studies showing this phenomenon and its boundary conditions. It was studied in 1994 by Anderson, Bjork, and Bjork. What I'm going to show you here is the typical graph that people get when they investigate retrieval-induced forgetting. Information that has been selectively practiced is going to be remembered very well. So the proportion of words recalled on the y-axis. Uh, and that is remembered much better than information that was part of the NRP baseline category. That is called a retrieval practice effect. Okay. More intriguingly, information that has been related to that practice suffers from retrieval-induced forgetting. That is remembered less well than the NRP category. Okay. Um, Notice that there's no difference in terms of what happened to the items during the experimental procedure between RP minus items and NRP items. The only difference has to do with whether the items are related or not related, conceptually related or not related to the practiced items. Okay. I'm not going to go too deep into this. The mechanism that explains this is an inhibitory mechanisms, even though there's controversy in the field around this. Some people say that inhibition is not involved, it's output interference. There's some evidence that inhibitory mechanisms are involved. That is, when people are selectively practicing information, what could happen is competitors come up for activation, and the cognitive system designed a way to push down those items that pop up for activation, because those are not the items that it's supposed to be retrieved. And that suppression lingers on, and we can find it in a cued recall test later on. And the findings that I'm going to describe in just a little bit are not dependent on whether it's inhibition or output interference, but I just want to mention this one potential explanation for the effect. What's more interesting for my purposes is this notion that what happens with retrieval-induced forgetting, if you place it in a social context, then you start talking about this notion of shaping each other's memories. So there's been research in 2007 by Cook, Coppell, and Hurst that found that retrieval-induced forgetting has an influence in the social context, such that a speaker can induce forgetting in a listener who just is sitting there and listens to the speaker selectively practicing information. And what that does, um, if you look at the memories of the two individuals who are involved in the interaction, is it aligns them. It shapes them in a way that makes those memories more aligned, more similar to one another after the conversation than before the conversation. So we build on this finding, what's called in the literature socially shared retrieval-induced forgetting, to create that bridge between retrieval-induced forgetting and collective memory. And here's how we did it. So this was the goal of this particular study, published in 2016, to just create that bridge between retrieval-induced forgetting and collective memories. So the way we did it, this is the procedure that we used. We had communities of individuals come in the lab at the same time. So we had multiple of these communities, 10 individuals in each of these communities, and we had 14 communities. What they did is they received a stimulus material that was in the form of a story. We call this paradigm the Peace Corps paradigm. Um, what we wanted to recreate, we wanted to create a more naturalistic um, stimulus that mimics the sort of stimulus materials that were used in retrieval-induced forgetting. And the way we did it is participants studied the stories about Peace Corps volunteers. So Mary was stationed in Bosnia, and for item one, she was involved in distributing water bottles to vulnerable communities. Item number two had to do with volunteering in an orphanage and helping kids learn information about their pasts. So then each of these items, the ones that you see there with M1, M2, M3, and 4, these are exemplars within the Mary category. And Adam was stationed somewhere else, and he was engaged in other activities and so on. So then we wanted to recreate in more naturalistic ways what the sort of paradigms that are used in retrieval-induced forgetting investigations. Okay, and then what we asked them to do is we asked them to individually recall this information. So they studied the information, then they individually recalled it, and then we asked them to have conversations with one another according to this network structure that's depicted in this dynamic representation of the procedure. The notion here is that these two individuals are going to have an interaction, a conversation, to jointly remember the information that they received in the study phase for about 3 minutes. And then they're going to switch, and then these individuals are going to have a conversation for another 3 minutes. This is the second round of the conversations, third round and fourth round of the conversation. So they have conversations to jointly remember the information that they studied initially, and that creates a conversational network structure. We did that using a software platform, which we call Software Platform for Human Interaction experiments, which allows for people to interact with one another in this chat-like version. So then they have just chats with one another. They don't see each other, but they chat with one another and they jointly remember the information as instructed. Okay. And after they have these conversations with one another, we again ask individuals to individually recall the information that they studied initially. Okay. So we have the pre-conversational recalls here. We have the post-conversational recalls here. Okay. And then here's what we do. We want to remember I told you that we're interested in the dynamical formation of collective memories over time. So what we want to do is we want to capture the collective memories of these communities from pre-conversation to post-conversation. But what we also need is we need an item-based measure of collective memory so that we can hook it up to the processes that might take place during conversations, particularly those involving retrieval-induced forgetting. Okay, so there's been some research in the early 90s by Susan Weldon. There's a chapter in which she describes ways to do this sort of analysis. And we were inspired by that work and we just adopted it here with a larger number of participants than she discussed in that chapter. So here's how we capture the collective memories of these communities. What you have in terms of a data structure, you have participants remembering items, right? Participant one remembering item one, item two, and item eight, with this different shading indicating the items that were remembered. Participant number two remembering these other items, participant number three remembering other items, right? So this is the matrix, the data matrix that we have, we start with. And then what we do is we transform this two-mode net matrix. It's called a two-mode matrix because there's a participant by item dimensions there. We transform it into an item by item matrix. And here, what we capture is we capture how many participants in the community remembered two items in common. So look at item one and item four. It has the number two here. What that means is that item one and item four were remembered by two participants in common, participant one and participant three. Okay. And then in this matrix, we populated with that metric that captures how many participants remembered the two items in common. And then we dichotomize that matrix with using a majority rule. If a majority of the participants in the community, which remember is 10 participants in a community, remember those two items in common, then it's a 1 in the matrix. If not, it's a 0 in the matrix. And then what we do is we simply graph the matrix that emerges out of this dichotomization process. And what you get here is essentially um, content-based representation of the collective memory. We call this collective memory graphs. What this is essentially how many participants, if there's a connection between these two items here, it means that the majority of the participants remember the two items together. So this is the closest we've come in the field in psychology to having a representation, an item-based, content-based representation of the collective memory of a community. Okay. Um, and what this could do then, we could run all sorts of network analysis to understand how central the different items are to the collective memories of the communities, right? So this is an actual community that we ran. In the pre-conversation, these are the connections among the different items. This is a representation of the pre-conversational collective memory of the community, and this is a representation of the post-conversational collective memory of the community. So what you can do is you can start running analysis to understand how central different items are to the collective memory of the community. Okay, so item 16, fairly peripheral, pre-conversation, but in the post-conversation, it becomes more central. Now, this is just like a visual analysis of how central it is, but we actually run network analysis using closeness centrality, how close different items are to all other items in the collective memory of the community. Okay, and you can start running all sorts of interesting analysis to figure out like how the dynamic of these different items from periphery to the center is a function of all sorts of different things that might happen in the network. Okay, so now this provides a representation, a metric for how central different items are in the collective memory of the community. But now what we need is we need to see whether these dynamics from pre-conversation to post-conversation are dependent on retrieval-induced forgetting. And the challenge there is, remember the retrieval-induced forgetting paradigm, it's a very straightforward paradigm, right? So like you study category exemplar pairs, and then the experimenter just makes decisions and counterbalances what items get remembered, practiced. They make that decision, and then they counterbalance across participants. But in this situation, we don't have that extreme control over what participants are going to practice because we allow them to have free-flowing conversations about the information that they received. And not only that, but each person in the network has three conversations in the network, right? So then we can't really isolate it to just one instance of retrieval practice because an item could be practiced multiple times or could be RP minus item multiple times. So what we did is the following. We isolated each conversation that each participant had in the community, in the network, um, in the following way. So we are going to focus on this target participant. That person had a conversation in round one with another person, and what happened in that conversation, they remembered certain items. Okay, they remembered this item, this item, this item, and this item. Now, after 3 minutes, they moved on to the next conversation. Um, and in the next conversation, what happened, irrespective of who said what, we just coded were the items remembered in that conversation. And then finally, they had a third conversation where other items were remembered. And what we did is we quantified the number of times an item was RP plus, RP minus, and NRP in the following way. We computed a reinforcement suppression score. Um, so we gave a -1 for an item that was related to something that was mentioned. So this first item here in the set received a -1 for this conversation, received a -1 for the second conversation, and received a +1 for the third conversation, just indicating that it was remembered in that conversation. Okay. And then there are items that were not remembered and that were not related to anything that was remembered in a particular conversation, such as this one, which received a 0 here, indicating that that is an NRP items. It shouldn't experience an increase in memory or a decrease in memory as a function of this processes that involve retrieval-induced forgetting. And then what we did is for each item, we summed up those scores that we gave to the different items. And then we aggregated all the scores for all the participants in the community. And furthermore, we used quartiles to classify them into items that were highly reinforced, That is, they were discussed a lot in people's conversations. Items that were highly suppressed, they were not discussed, and they're typically tended to be related to those discussed. And then moderately suppressed and moderately reinforced as a function of those aggregate scores that we computed for them. Okay, so now we have a way to capture the processes involving retrieval-induced forgetting in people's conversations. Okay, and now we're going to relate these processes that take place during conversations with the dynamic of the item from pre-conversation to post-conversation. So here are the results. On the y-axis, you have the post minus pre-centrality difference scores for the different items. The higher the score, what it means is that it becomes more central in the collective memory of the community. The lower the score, it becomes more peripheral in the collective memory of the community. And on the x-axis, you have the different types of items: highly reinforced, moderately suppressed, and highly suppressed. And so what we're finding is that um, information that's discussed a lot in people's conversations becomes central to the collective memory of the community, whereas information that's related to what people discuss becomes fairly peripheral in the collective memory of the community. Um, okay, so now what I will say is that we did this study in a fairly controlled environment. There were things that, they were flexible in terms of people's conversations, but it was a fairly controlled environment. The stimulus material was fairly controlled. And we extended these findings to a real world context. We have a paper in which we look at how people shape each other's memories and how socially shared retrieval induced forgetting is involved in people shaping each other's memories of their September 11 attacks. We have a paper in 2015 in which we show that if you make people anxious, they're much more likely to experience socially shared retrieval induced forgetting when they listen to an expert. Um, Socially shared retrieval induced forgetting, we found, is also modulated by motivational forces. So then when people are motivated to retrieve information that's related to what the speaker mentions, then the socially shared retrieval induced forgetting processes are disrupted. And we did that in the context of atrocities committed in Iraq by American soldiers. And then also motivations that have to do with um, people's willingness to relate to others, Princeton students to other Princeton students, or Princeton students to other Yale students, also modulate retrieval-induced forgetting, such that when the person is part of your in-group, you're much more likely to concurrently retrieve the information and to experience socially shared retrieval-induced forgetting. And then finally, we found that the collective memories of the community are influenced by the conversational network structure that we create. In the paper that I just described earlier, we essentially had two conditions: the cluster condition and the non-cluster condition, just manipulating the conversational network structure that people went through. And we found that that makes the difference. In the non-cluster condition, communities reached much higher convergence than in the cluster condition. And then also we found in a different paper that bridge ties, so these are ties between clusters of individuals, are very important when it comes to the formation of collective memories. Okay, so you could imagine that these collective representations in the form of collective memories, are very important for political entrepreneurs. Um, I'm going to give you a couple of examples of how they're important to political entrepreneurs. And by that, I mean politicians, pundits who have a vested interest in shaping the collective representations of large communities. So if you think back, in 2001, 2003, the Bush administration was involved in an effort to convince the American public that the Iraqis, Saddam Hussein, had weapons of mass destruction. So then there was a concerted effort to provide that evidence to the American public to convince them that it's worthwhile invading Iraq. And that essentially led to a shaping of the representation of the Americans to the degree that most Americans then ended up supporting the invasion of Iraq. Okay, so then this is an example in which you have a politician trying to shape the collective representation of the community and providing evidence to that effect. Okay? More recently, you would probably resonate with this. Vladimir Putin was involved in an effort to convince the Russian public that Ukraine does not have a legitimate right to exist. So then you can see, if you analyze his discourses and the kind of the news stories that were pushed out by the administration, you would recognize this concerted effort to try to shape the Russians' representations of what Ukraine was or was not. Okay, and what you see is that this effort corresponds to a very high support for the war in Ukraine, and that is extremely resilient. If you look at the American support of the Iraq invasion, actually goes down really fast because weapons of mass destruction were not discovered. People started having conversations about that and changed their opinion about whether the Iraq invasion was justified or not. But with the Russian support for the war, that's much more constant. There are reasons why I believe that's the case. But this is just to say that political entrepreneurs are involved in this efforts to try to shape these collective representations, in this case, collective memories, because they're so important for um, uh, what people believe in and also for the courses of actions that they support. So that was the reasoning behind the next project um, um, that we did, which involved collective beliefs. We started with this finding by my then graduate student, Madalina Vlășceanu, who's featured here. She was the brains behind this experiment. She's now a professor at Stanford University. And what she found is that this retrieval-induced forgetting processes are not relegated and isolated to just memories, but they actually seep through in the believability domain. So instead of just using this piece of information provided to people, she gave people statements that are associated with their beliefs. So sugar makes kids hyperactive is one of them, or eating carrots increases the eyesight for kids. So then you give the statements to people, to participants, in this category structures, nutrition and other categories. And what you find is that if you ask them to selectively practice half of the items from half of the categories, we had 24 beliefs, and then the participants were randomly assigned to this counterbalancing schedule to selectively practice half of the statements from half of the categories. What you find is that that selective practice resulted in increases in believability for the practiced information, but decreases in believability for statements that were related to those practices. So building on this finding, we wanted to know what is the impact of public speakers on the collective beliefs of communities. Okay, and in this paper, we use the following paradigm. So we have communities of individuals, 12 participants in each community, and they were asked to evaluate the believability of 24 statements. Then, after they studied this information, they were exposed to a public speaker who just presented half of the items from all the categories. Okay. And then the public speaker was essentially in the form of some sort of text that they were provided coming from an individual. So all the participants in each of the community received that information from the public speaker. And as I mentioned, two of the items in each category were practiced by the public speaker. Two of the items were not practiced, but related to those practiced. And then after the public speaker provided that information to all the participants, participants were asked to have conversations with one another according to this conversational network structure. After they had these conversations, we asked them to remember all the statements that they initially read. And what we're finding is the recall proportion on the y-axis, on the x-axis, whether the information was mentioned by the public speaker or related to what the public speaker mentioned. Okay, so what you see is that this large difference in recall for the information that was provided by the public speaker. Okay. And then I should also say that some of the networks were experimental networks where the public speaker provided that information, and some of the networks were control networks. There was no public speaker in those networks, and those were yoked to the communities that had a public speaker, and we're finding this effects such that the information provided by the public speaker is remembered better than the information that was related to that provided by the public speaker. Okay. But then what we also did is we provided participants with all the statements again, and we asked them how believable the statements are. And what we're doing is we're computing this difference score between how believable they were post interactions with how believable they were pre-conversations, pre-interactions. And what we're finding is we're finding that the believability of items mentioned by the public speaker went up, but the believability of the items related to those mentioned by the public speaker went down, okay? Suggesting that the public speaker can have an influence on what people believe. And what's interesting here, I will say there are some boundary conditions here. The initial paper in 2018, we found that only moderately held beliefs are susceptible to these influences. If somebody holds some beliefs very strongly, then they're not going to be affected by this manipulation, or there's no believability for the items, then they're not going to be as susceptible. So moderately held beliefs are susceptible to this influence. And the other interesting part about the collective phenomenon, the collective beliefs of this experiment is that what happened is the public speaker mentioned those items, and that influenced the sort of conversations that people had. So those conversations amplified the message that the public speaker had, which resulted in this phenomenon of retrieval induced forgetting for beliefs. Um, um, and I should say, this study was done with a follow-up, a 1 week follow-up, and we're finding the same pattern of results for both memory and believability 1 week after the manipulation. Okay. So then the notion here is that if you have George W. Bush trying to induce forgetting in the information that weapons of mass destructions are held by Saddam Hussein, what he should do in this situation is essentially to discuss information that's not that, but is related to that, such that the US went into Iraq for to spread democracy to other nations. So then notice, and I think this is what gave us the idea for the next investigation, the notion that you can shape the collective representations of communities. In this situation, the shaping is very negative, has deleterious consequences, but it's not always the case. There are situations where you can justifiably intervene in communities to just make these communities more resilient to certain shocks that are happening. So then with that, I'm going to transition to a project where we were interested in diminishing the negative emotions experienced by individuals and communities. Okay, so uh, imagine a situation in which there's a pandemic, for instance, and people are experiencing a lot of anxiety, a lot of panic around the pandemic. What you could do is you could select some individuals in the communities for a treatment that involves diminishing the negative emotions and the anxiety associated with going through the pandemic. And what might happen is then these individuals who are treated are going to have an effect on individuals who are connected to them to the degree that they're going to reduce the negative emotions and the anxiety associated with that pandemic. So that was the thinking around this project. And we didn't do it in the context of the pandemic. We did it in a different context that's also a real world context of intergroup conflict. So what we wanted to do here is we wanted to investigate whether we are able to reduce the negative emotions in intergroup conflict. So imagine there's the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, and we wanted to know, can we reduce the negative emotions that people experience in this intergroup conflict by using this community-based interventions? That is, can we treat certain participants in a community in order for us to reduce the negative emotions of the entire community? The notion here is that we're not going to have the resources to influence every individual in that community, but we might have the resources to influence some individuals in that community to the degree that might result in the diminishment of the negative emotions across the entire community. So that's what we were interested in here. I will say this study was spearheaded by Amit Goldenberg, who was just a terrific scholar. And he was the brains behind this experiment. That was part of the team that designed the experiment, but he was really spearheading this project. And the data was collected before the October 7 attacks in Israel. So then that's an important qualification to be aware of. Okay, the notion that we had here was that um, we could use the extensive research on reappraisal to try to diminish people's negative emotions. So then, if you think about reappraisal, there's this notion that you can influence people's emotions if you ask them to reinterpret a certain situation through other lenses so that they can control the emotions that they're experiencing. So think about this situation. So you are provided with this image and you ask the participant, how does this image make you feel? Extremely negative to extremely positive, -5 to +5. Probably, if you look at this image, it exhibits some sort of pain experienced by somebody. Probably people are going to say that it's on the negative side. Now, you can ask them to reappraise the image. So think about another context that might diminish the negative experience that you have while you watch this. And then people might say, oh, what could happen here is this person is an actor and he's just trying to exhibit the pain that they're feeling. Okay. So now if you reappraise this image through this different lens to say that this person is an actor, then you might have a different emotional experience and you're not going to feel as negatively as before. So then the notion is that if you teach people to reappraise a situation, then this might result in a reduction in the negative emotions that they experience. The way it's applied to a conflict context, participants see images such as this, and then they're asked how much negative emotions they experience as a result of seeing this, and they can give you a high estimate for the negative emotions. But you could ask people to reappraise this image, and then what's going to happen is they're going to come up with explanations that is likely to reduce the negative emotions that they experience when they watch this image. And that difference between these two conditions gives you the magnitude of the impact of the reappraisal intervention on people's emotions. So again, what we wanted to do here is to see whether we can use emotional contagion and reappraisal to decrease the negative collective emotions of Israeli participants. So here's what we did. This is the procedure that we used. These are Israeli participants. Uh, we had 2,600 participants, um, and these participants were grouped into groups of six. So you see six participants in each group. They study this image. All these images were negatively emotional and they were related to the conflict, to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. These are all Israeli participants. Um, and then what they have to do is they have to describe this image, just to type in a description of the image that they just saw. Those descriptions are going to be presented to all the participants in the group. And then they are provided with the image again, and they're asked to rate their emotions, uh, positive, negative emotions about this image. And that rating is also made public to all the participants in the group. Okay. And they do that 20 times. So there are 20 trials. Each time there's a new image relevant for the conflict, and they engage in a similar procedure by which they type the description and then they evaluate their emotions. Okay. Now, our manipulation was the number of participants who received the reappraisal intervention before they even start the experiment. Okay, so the intervention was fairly short. I think maybe 10 minutes intervention, they are provided with a way to reappraise images. And also they're given an example and they have to do it themselves, after which they start the experiment. But again, we manipulated the number of people in each group that who received that reappraisal intervention. So we had groups in which one person received the intervention, the reappraisal intervention, groups in which two people, three people, four people, five people, and all the people in the group received that reappraisal intervention. Um, and then we also had groups where none of the individuals were treated with a reappraisal intervention. Okay. And then here on the y-axis, the negative emotions experienced by participants. And on the x-axis is the proportion of regulators in each of the groups. Regulators is those individuals who received the reappraisal intervention before they started the experiment. Okay, so here are the findings. These are the individuals in the groups who are the regulators, the people who receive the reappraisal intervention. And what you see is that the more regulators are in the group, the less negative their emotions associated with the images. Okay, so this is an interesting finding, already hinting at the fact that there's some emotional contagion. If you're part of groups that regulate, the more people that regulate in your group, the more likely you are to regulate yourself, but you've also been trained to regulate, okay? The more interesting finding is here for the control participants. The control participants are essentially these blue people here, people who did not receive a reappraisal intervention. They were just placed in groups with individuals who had received the reappraisal intervention. And what we find is that there's an inflection point around here between 25% and 40% of the participants in these groups. If they were treated, then what happens is the reappraisal essentially is contaminating the individuals who did not receive the reappraisal intervention. Okay. And then what we wanted to establish, we have an indirect effect for that, but we believe the way this happens is through the language that people use. So the reappraisers use a certain type of language, then contaminates the individuals who did not receive the reappraisal intervention, and they start using similar language. The evidence that we use something that's called semantic projection analysis, which is described in the paper, but essentially we just want to get a signal for the language used by reappraisers. So then we took the language used by groups where everybody was reappraised in the group. We took that language and we subtracted it from language that was used by individuals who were part of pure control. So everybody in those groups were individuals who were not treated. And then the semantic projection analysis just comes up with a vector that describes the difference in the language used by the reappraisers versus the non-reappraisers. And then we created this metric to understand how different the language used by individuals who were part of these mixed groups, how similar was to that pure reappraisal language that we derived from the semantic projection analysis. And what you can find is that the more reappraised participants were in their groups, the more likely were participants in the control conditions to use that sort of language, that sort of reappraisal language, despite the fact that they were not treated themselves with reappraisal. Okay, good. So I hope I'm reaching the end of the presentation soon. I hope I was able to convince you that there's an interesting approach that we're using in the lab to investigate this large-scale processes involving collective memories, collective beliefs, and collective emotions. The one thing that I would say here is that I showed you how to do this sort of studies with one cognitive mechanism, but I think that most cognitive mechanisms, most cognitive phenomena have emergent properties at a collective level. So then it's a call for arms to cognitive psychologists who do cognitive psychology work to expand their thinking into how those cognitive level individual mechanisms could influence large scale dynamics. And I think the approach that I provided here, the one that we use in our lab, is able to bridge between this cognitive level mechanisms and large-scale social outcomes with respect to these processes that we've been discussing: memory, beliefs, and emotions. A second point here is this notion of interventions. Um, it's, you obviously have to have this thinking that takes into account ethical considerations. In some situations, it might not make sense, or it might have negative consequences to influence the representations of entire communities. But I believe that if you engage yourself and if you're careful about those ethical implications, there's a huge promise here in terms of creating interventions that are going to be more successful and more likely to have positive impacts on our communities. Okay, so this type of thinking, I believe, is going to be is going to lead to fruitful conversations and new taxonomies. For instance, in a paper that we published just a few weeks ago, Dorothy Thompson was the lead on this paper, but there were other amazing scholars part of this paper. Bill Hurst, my former PhD advisor, Olivier Luminet, David Pillamer, and Robin Feibush. We proposed a new taxonomy to conceptualize of the sorts of memories that are personally relevant for individuals. So then, if you think about the time when you learned that you were admitted into your PhD program or your or college, you would call that an autobiographical memory because you experienced it, you remember it. Now, what happens is in our minds, we have memories that are not experienced by ourselves. So our friends telling us about the birth of their son, that's not personally experienced, but it's personally relevant for me because it's my friend and I care about my friend. Similarly, stories, family stories about the past, my grandparent meeting my grandmother, that's not personally experienced, but it's personally relevant for me. And then we can go about, down the line to identify the different types of memories that are personally relevant, but they were not experienced by me. And what we're doing is we're proposing a new term to contrast this notion of autobiographical memory to allobiographical memories. The notion is that these are personally relevant memories that we have, but they were not experienced by us. And then we provide this taxonomy to start thinking about these allobiographical memories in a more programmatic fashion and to start investigating um, uh, empirically some of these differences. Um, Another strength of this approach is that using this network approach, then you can start addressing difficult problems. There's a paper by Bob Willer and a lot of other authors in 2024 in Science trying to diminish the polarization that exists in the American society, 30,000 participants, 25 interventions to try to diminish polarization. Now, what ended up happening is they found effects and they managed to reduce polarization among individuals that they tested. Um, but that was only immediately after the intervention, after the interventions were deployed. If you check within a month of the intervention, most people go back to the baseline in terms of their beliefs about the outgroups, political outgroups. So then, what we're saying is that if you have an approach that takes networks into account, then you will understand that what happened in those contexts in terms of the inability of these interventions to diminish polarization is that those beliefs are structurally embedded. That is, they're not in a vacuum. They're not isolated from one another. Rather, there's a belief structure that you have to take into account. We call that structural embeddedness. And there's also social embeddedness. Once people go through these interventions, 5-minute interventions, after they do that, then they go back into their social environments, media, mass media landscapes, and then they revert back to their prior beliefs. So then, in order for us to understand how these collective beliefs are shaped and whether they are could be dislodged, you have to take into account the structural embeddedness and social embeddedness. So in a paper in 2024 in the Perspectives in Psychological Science, we provide this model to think about beliefs in ways that go beyond that kind of unitary view of beliefs, them being part of structures of beliefs that are connected to other pieces of evidence that people use and norms that people use And furthermore, this is only within an individual mind. You can understand them as living in different people's minds who interact with one another and shape each other's belief systems in ways that reinforce them. Okay, so with this understanding, you are better able to intervene and try to change people's beliefs. And then finally, I just want to leave you with this thought uh, about human conflict. So if you look at human, and this is an argument that I got from Yuval Harari, which resonated with me, and I just want to put it on the slide to kind of end. If you look at human conflict, um, even though there's this analysis that a lot of it has to do with resources and fight over resources, um, Harari disagrees, and I'm with him on that front. I think a lot of the conflicts that we see around the world now is not necessarily about resources, is not about land. It's much more to do with stories, the stories that we tell. This notion that who does this land belong to is associated with who God that gave this land to. What are the symbols that represent my ancestors, and I care about them, and I'm just going to defend my land because there's a connection with my ancestors. So then the notion is that these conflicts that we see around the world are not necessarily about resources. They're much more to do with the stories that we tell about our groups. Um, and these stories essentially just spin around this collective memories, collective emotions, and collective beliefs to put us in this acrimonious sort of dynamics. Now, the good news about this view of conflict not having to do necessarily with resources is that if it was about resources, then we would have to fight it out and whoever is the best wins. But with stories, you can change people's stories. You can shape them, you can adjust them so that you make the stories less conflictual. The kind of complication there is that the stories are not easy to change. The stories are deeply ingrained. They're connected to people's sacred values. People are willing to die for these stories. So not easy, but this type of thinking that looks at this collective level phenomena in interaction is going to get us closer to understanding how communities behave and how they could step back from this conflicts. Okay, that's all I have for you, and I'm ready to take some questions.
Hey, Dr. Coman, thank you again for just a fascinating and informative presentation. We do have a few questions that have been submitted, and I'll go through those. For anyone who's attending, you can feel free to submit your questions using the Q&A button in your Zoom window. When you submit questions, you can also see questions posed by others and upvote them. And if you're uncomfortable posting questions, you can post anonymously if you wish. So thank you again, Dr. Coman. I'll go ahead and give you the questions that have come in. First
Sure.
question is, thank you for this presentation. It was very informative. Where are you going next with this research?
Oh, that's an interesting question. We have several projects in my lab. A lot of them are on the formation of collective beliefs. Um, I'm very excited about this intervention work that tries to reduce misinformation, for instance, in communities. I'm very excited about interventions having to do with diminishing negative emotions experienced by different communities. Um, and I organize this initiative. It's a strategic partnership with University of Tokyo and Princeton to try to bring a group of interdisciplinary scholars together, computer scientists, neuroscientists, psychologists, um, to start thinking about these communities and how can we create the environments for improving their lives. So I think one conversation that kind of seems to be percolating is this notion of using artificial intelligence for good. And there we have this thinking of sensing what happens in networks and also intervening using artificial intelligence agents with that thinking of can we improve the collective problem solving of communities? Can we create the context for people to be more creative as they're thinking about the problems that they're confronting with? Can we use artificial intelligence to diminish the cognitive biases that people are using when they're kind of making decisions?
That's certainly very relevant and topical today. So thank you for that.
Yeah.
The next question is, can you state what you feel would be the big open question that remains with regards to your research in this area?
Oh, I feel, as I mentioned in the talk, um, there's we in my lab, we've done a lot of research on retrieval induced forgetting and relating it to large scale social outcomes with regards to collective memory. I feel there's a lot of work to be done by a lot of other people in the field, especially cognitive psychologists, but also social psychologists and maybe together, to try to elucidate what happens with other cognitive phenomena. I can imagine a lot of other cognitive phenomena are gonna be related to this large scale outcomes, especially given the wide range that we're discussing in terms of memories, beliefs, and emotions. I can imagine that there are a lot of individual level mechanisms if then if you put them together and then you take this approach of collective level dynamics, they're going to have emergent properties. So I think what I would like to see in this space is more research to try to connect this individual level cognitive mechanisms to large scale social outcomes. Um, I think there's research here and there, but I think from my self-interested position, I'd like to see more of that.
Thank you. One final question that we have, and again, anyone who does have any questions can feel free to post them. We do still have some time. But the final question posted is, what do you think are some of the real world implications of your research?
Mm. Yeah. Um, Note that I tried, during the course of the presentation to kind of highlight some real world examples in terms of what Bush is doing, what Putin is doing, what leaders are doing to shape our collective representations. So I think um, there's really a lot of implications that this work could have, especially if people start investigating in more applied sort of domains. Notice that the first project that I presented with the formation of collective memories was fairly controlled. It was just like this information that people received. It wasn't like a real world, it was a story that they received, but it wasn't something that people cared deeply about. So you can imagine that in situations where it's going to be closer and more ecologically valid, there are different processes that might take shape in those sort of environments. I think some of the implications have to do with people's collective beliefs. How can you create these interventions to diminish misinformation or conspiracy theories when it comes to the propagation of false collective beliefs? There's an interesting research that's starting now on the creation of false collective memories. These are real world. There are multiple examples of people coming together to form a false collective memory and start remembering things that never happened. So if that happens on the belief front, uh, there's misinformation that's percolating in our environments, especially with social media and not being enough regulation in this context. Then conspiracy theories, false beliefs can take hold. And then, so I think there's research that could take place in this space using these approaches. And then on collective emotions, um, especially the sort of project that I described earlier with Israeli participants, this is really real world. This is Israeli participants who are being presented with information that's emotional for them, and then we're trying to diminish the negative emotions that they're experiencing. And I will note there, I think it's an important point to make. Um, I made a point about ethical implications of this work. One important ethical implication when it comes to intervening on people's collective emotions is this notion that sometimes maybe diminishing emotions is going to reduce their willingness to engage in action, and they might want to engage in that action, right? If there's an atrocity happening, there's genocide happening, diminishing people's outrage about it is not the way to go, right? You want people to react. You want people to be out there and to make their voices heard, and to influence this processes. So then the ethical implication there, I think, is very important and very important for me as well. So as people apply this thinking, these findings to real world circumstances, the ethical dimension always has to be present, especially when it comes to interventions.
Thank you. That is all the questions we have. If anybody has any questions, we got a few minutes. Certainly feel free to open that, or I'm sorry, submit them using the Q&A button. Other than that, I do want to say thank you to everyone for your time and attendance today. And thank you, Dr. Coman, for just a fantastic presentation that has a lot of real world and practical applications, especially in today's climate. For everyone attending, just want to remind you that our next One World seminar will take place on May 21st at the same time. And that will be Dr. Francis Wang, and it's Euclidean or Not, Human Navigation in Curved and Wormhole Spaces. That registration will be posted, will be open this week and can be found on the Psychonomic Society website. If there are no more questions, I'm going to thank you, Dr. Coman, and thank all of our attendees. And thank you, as always, to our wonderful ASL interpreters and the Psychonomic Society for hosting this series. And we'll give everybody back the rest of their day.
Excellent. Thank you so much.
Thank you.